things you say. Talk to me in your own special way. That's right. Welcome, New Mexico, around the country and around the world, if you're listening. Welcome to Dialogue, KSFR's Friday evening talk show where the conversation starts with you. I'm your host, MK. I'd like to begin every broadcast with a huge thank you for listening this week and or any week. I always consider it an honor to have you join me and take the time out of your busy lives to give me a listen. It means the world to me, and I can always only hope it means as much to you. Chocolate has long been a favorite indulgence, but behind every chocolate bar we unwrap, there's a world of power struggles and political maneuvering over its most important ingredient, cocoa, which is the name of a new book hitting the shelves, and its author is Kristy Leissle. Her book reveals how cocoa, which brings pleasure and wealth to relatively few, depends upon an extensive global trade system that exploits the labor of 5 million growers, as well as countless other workers and vulnerable groups. The reality of this dramatic inequity, she explains, is often masked by the social, cultural, emotional, and economic values humans have placed upon cocoa from its earliest cultivation in Mesoamerica to the present day. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us, Kristy.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
It's a pleasure to have you. So let's begin by asking, what is the difference between cocoa and chocolate?
Cocoa is really an agricultural product. It comes from a farm. It's not very much processed by the time it gets into a factory. It's a little bit processed, but not much. Chocolate, on the other hand, is definitely a manufactured good. It comes from a factory. And really, when it comes out of that factory, it doesn't look anything at all like how it started. And it's even sometimes hard to imagine that it began life on a tree. And, you know, a final way that I like to think about it is cocoa is a commodity, right? And so commodities are goods that are traded, they're fungible, so every cocoa bean is considered the same as every other cocoa bean, whereas chocolate, it's really a luxury good. And for many of us, it's an everyday luxury, but it's definitely a luxury, and that's a real contrast to this agricultural commodity that's traded globally.
And which countries are the most important to cocoa production, and why?
Somewhere around 3/4 of all cocoa produced in the world comes from sub-Saharan Africa. The world's third largest cocoa producing country is Indonesia, and so we need to pay attention to Indonesia as well. Usually somewhere in the 10% range, a little bit less than that maybe. And so these are the major producer countries.
And tell us what the average life would be like on a cocoa farm.
They're not very comfortable places. So cocoa grows really only between about 20 degrees north and south of the equator. And because the tree evolved in the tropical rainforest in the Amazon River basin, it likes that environment. And so it likes a very humid, really for humans, it's very sweaty, it's very hot, it's very uncomfortable. There's lots of bugs, there's lots of things that aren't nice to have around, like scorpions and snakes and things like that. And it's really pretty sweaty labor. You know, you're usually far from comforts, right? You're far from a place of electricity or a paved road. So even getting to a farm can be really challenging. And then once you're there, it's not like a pleasant climate-controlled office environment. It's actually quite an uncomfortable place to be.
Far from the chocolate we consume.
Definitely. You know, it's a world away, and farms are, you know, by definition, a part of the rural environment. And so, you know, once you leave the city, right, like I live in the capital in Accra, I have everything here, right? I have pretty steady electricity, I have paved roads, I have air-conditioned grocery stores. When you get out into the farms, you know, you're talking about unpaved roads that can go on for miles and miles, extremely challenging to travel over. Many places do not have electrification. Sanitation is a huge issue, and I feel like I can't speak enough about the challenge of not having plumbing and bathrooms, right? Like I've been in villages where there is one communal pit, right? And that is the toilet for the whole village. And so, I mean, we are really talking about environments where many of the things that you or I might take for granted in our everyday lives, it's just kind of basic infrastructure, are just not there. I often get asked, how much does a cocoa farmer make a day or a year? Somewhere around $2 a day is what if you average cocoa income out over the course of a year, which it doesn't all come, it doesn't come over the course of a year. It comes in really kind of concentrated periods during the main harvest season. So we have to average it out to see what it would be per day. But that's that's a misleading number, because if that is what your one farmer is earning from cocoa, generally there's a lot of people who depend on that money, and so it's even less than that per person in the household. But I think for me, it's what I like to talk about is the range, because I have seen farmers at the really low end of production. I mean, really do not have much farmland, or it's not very productive, and who maybe grow 2 bags of cocoa a year, right? Right now in Ghana, the price per bag of cocoa is around the US $100, which means that if you're a farmer who's growing 2 bags of cocoa a year, then your whole annual income is $200. I mean, prices are not the same here as they are in other parts of the world, but $200 is not enough for anybody to live on.
What would be the equivalent if you take into account the monetary exchange? Do you have any idea of what that would be the equivalent of in our economy?
I can't give you like a figure, like a dollar amount, how much it would be, but what I can say, it's not possible to fulfill even your basic needs. If a farmer is making $200 a year off their cocoa, then they are definitely growing their own food, right? So they're not spending money on food. They're probably growing it themselves, and almost certainly they would have some other source of cash income. And farmers are really diverse. I have seen, I can't think of a farmer I've met who didn't have some other business that brought in some other form of income. And so if you're at that low end, then you're definitely having to find a way to make ends meet in another way than from your cocoa income. But I also want to be really clear that, cocoa has made a lot of people pretty wealthy. Cocoa became the widespread crop that it is in this part of the world because some people did really well by it. And, I've seen farmers like 200 bags a year, more than that. If you're selling 200 bags, you're making $20,000 US dollars in Ghana, and that can be a pretty reasonably comfortable life.
Yeah, absolutely. And as a result, it's also been used as a political power tool, correct?
Definitely. When you think about it in this way, like the poverty way, and think about how poor farmers are, how much they struggle with that lack of infrastructure that I was talking about, because that's another way to measure poverty, right? Not just the income that you get, but what are your surroundings like? Do you have roads? Do you have cars? Do you have electricity? Do you have clean water? All these things contribute to poverty that are not income related. When you look at the state of most cocoa farming livelihood, which we can definitely say is poor, there is a politics to that. You don't keep that many people in such an exploited situation without having some people on the other end really, really benefiting, right? So there's always a balance, right? The people who are losing out, we know for sure that there's people really gaining from this industry in really kind of wealth generating ways. And also just in our own enjoyment, right? We enjoy chocolate. Chocolate is cheap. We can eat it every day if we want to. And that's a benefit that we enjoy because farmers don't really make a lot of money. And I think that kind of power differential between the people growing cocoa and the people who are consuming chocolate, that's a political situation. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, that's so who and what has the power in the industry? There's a whole sort of difference between priorities in the chocolate industry versus priorities in the cocoa industry. Can you talk about that and how that enters into the equation of the exploitation of the cocoa farmer?
Yeah, very much so. And so, again, there's many ways of thinking about this, and one way is to sort of look broadly at the industry as a whole, and including cocoa and chocolate, and we can really see gender differences, and we can see differences in ethnicity and migrant status. So, if we take the whole industry, men generally benefit in ways that women don't or can't, or find it really challenging to. The companies and people based in Europe and North America have benefited way more than people and companies based in those tropical producer countries, that I talked about in Africa, Asia, also Central and South America. And, if you're on the cocoa side, if you're a migrant to a place, you face a lot more challenges than someone who is indigenous to the region, who are generally in a more powerful position. So we can look at it that way, right? Like men benefit, people in what we might call the global north benefit, indigenous people benefit. And then we can also look at it in the way of like companies. And so the 5 million cocoa farmers in the world, at least, as you mentioned, and there's only 5, 6, 7 chocolate companies really globally that predominate. And so when you think about that, you can see that power and wealth are really concentrated in these handful of big companies. And the people who run them, right? So there's companies that are filled with people. And so the people in charge of those companies definitely benefit. They definitely have power in this industry in the way that those 5 million cocoa farmers just really can't. And so there's lots of ways of looking at who's powerful and who's not powerful in this industry. That's what keeps me going as a scholar, right? And as a researcher, there's just endless things to discover and learn.
Yeah, so how do we make it a more equitable situation for the cocoa farmers? What can be done? And what can we do as consumers to help change that equation?
Yeah, so I mean that's a great question, and it's one that I do think about a lot because I don't have an easy answer for it. I know that there's a real desire on the part of so many people to want to take action and buy the right chocolate, and I can't say that there's any one chocolate bar that's really changing the world. What I can say is that there are many companies, from small ones to big ones, that are doing really interesting, innovative stuff and to improve the lots of farmers. And so, I would say this on the big scale of things, right? If we take the global cocoa industry, I don't see a great deal of potential for large-scale change. What I think we desire is that cocoa farmers, all 5 million of them, will somehow be elevated economically to a point where like, you or I might consider it a comfortable life. And I just don't think the mathematics would work out there. It is inconceivable to me how we could really and truly take farmers out of poverty and get them to a point where we might say it's middle class living. The infrastructure is a big part of that, right? So even if you raise the price of cocoa by a factor of 10, you'd still be dealing with infrastructure challenges like the pit toilets and, no running water. So there's that too. But I want to say very genuinely that there's just so many people working so hard in this industry to make change on a smaller scale. And I think that's where we really need to pay attention, like who is doing interesting, innovative work, and it's not always going to be the same work. And if we can educate ourselves as consumers about those companies and people who are doing that work, then we put ourselves in a better position. We empower ourselves, actually, by learning more about this industry and the people who are creating change in it.
I mean, I myself worked in manufacturing for a period of time and had my own business. And trying to sell things at the rate to compensate the people that I was getting the product from abroad properly would mean raising the price to such a degree that I just wouldn't be able to compete, and it was just ridiculous. But it really makes you wonder, in a world of global economy, increasingly global economy, how we are going to rectify this, because it needs to be rectified somehow. I mean, we have to, as a human consciousness, together think about how we're impacting each other. So I can understand. I guess I'm just, as I'm listening to you, I understand why this is a difficult question to answer. So how we make it a more equitable world, as it were, because in many ways the industry is just so already cemented into its own infrastructure, right, that it's hard to pull it out of that. So what are the ways that people are taking action in the world to make it a more just industry? What are the kind of things they're doing? I'm just curious.
Yeah. And there's many examples that I can give, and I'm so grateful for the point that you made about your own experience in manufacturing, and that even if you raise the retail price of something, because I hear that a lot, like, well, if we all just pay $10 a chocolate bar, but there's very little way to get that back if the value chain is so spread out the way it is. And that is one of the things that I have seen people really working hard on and doing some excellent work in trying to make that whole supply chain and indeed the whole value chain actually geographically much smaller. And in fact, it's one of the things that I talked about in the book when I was thinking about ways to do exactly what you're describing. How do we make change? Because the industry isn't sustainable. And I really admire the companies that are compressing the value chain. And so there's more examples now than ever before. And so one really interesting one is in Hawaii, because in Hawaii is the only place in the U.S. where you can grow cocoa commercially and be successful. It's just at the edge of the growing range for the tree. And there, most of the people who are growing cocoa, the where it's manufactured into chocolate and even sold is not too far away, maybe just on one of the other Hawaiian islands. And so there you see compression of the value chain, and more of that value of chocolate stays local.
Okay, so that's what. So when you talk about compressing the value chain, you're saying trying to keep the industry within one area,
Yes.
Right? Okay, so in a sense, it becomes centralized good to a particular part of the world.
Yes. And that is what really, that's the whole history of cocoa in what we call Mesoamerica, which is, the southern part of Mexico and the part of Central America, because for most of its history, cocoa was exclusive to that part of the world and was grown and processed and traded and consumed and, all just in that one little area. Wow. Now, the supply chain and the value chain is absolutely global. I mean, it's totally far-flung. And so what I see with real hope is the people who are working hard to compress it again. And I wanted to mention Maru chocolate, which is based in Vietnam, which is not a big producer of cocoa. But what Maru has done is a similar thing. It's not a vertically integrated company, which means it's not that the chocolate company owns the cocoa farms or vice versa. But it is the case that it's all happening within a really kind of tight geographical area, and so the value can end up staying more local. And one of the places that I really spend most of my time thinking about is right here in Ghana, because I will mention that in West Africa, while this is the predominant producer region, there is virtually no consumption of chocolate here. And it was just never adopted as a food crop. It has remained pretty much exclusively a cash crop. And cocoa's been in this part of the world for, well over a century. Now it is changing, right? And so when I moved here to Accra earlier this year, I can tell you now the delight and the thrill that I felt when I walked into a grocery store and I started seeing locally made chocolate bars, because that had just never been the case. Now I can think off the top of my head probably 10 chocolate makers or chocolatiers based right here in Accra. That's a lot. And so if we look even at Ghana, we see this change. We see this dynamism where people here are saying, we've been growing cocoa for a century and just sending it out of the country to be made into chocolate somewhere else. You know what? We're going to take that back. We're going to keep the value here. And it's very, very, very small scale. But you know what? That's a start. And we cannot go anywhere until we make a start.
Yeah, it makes me wonder, then, are there companies in the U.S. that could invest in some of those smaller homegrown, marketed chocolate companies to help support those farmers? Is there the possibility for collaboration between larger companies supporting these smaller local companies?
Absolutely. Absolutely. In various ways. I mean, chocolate making is really capital intensive. You need a lot of machinery. You don't need as much labor, but you need machines. You need electricity. You need power to keep the things running. You need factory space. You just need a lot of stuff. And I would say that to scale up, definitely investment will be critical to establishing that kind of that kind of machinery and factory space here. But the other thing too is exporting these goods. Right now, only one of the companies that I know of here, they're called Niche Chocolate. I believe they are the only ones who are exporting their products, and it doesn't go to the U.S. so far as I'm aware. And so, I feel confident that exporting their product would be something that most of these other companies would be interested in as well, and that'd be fantastic to have Ghana-grown cocoa, Ghana-made chocolate, getting out there in the world for people to understand and enjoy. And I think it would bring us all a little bit closer, to cocoa itself.
Yeah, the biggest question that keeps running through my mind is, how on earth are you ever going to get huge multinational companies to give up their chocolate and their chocolate profits to go help the folks in Ghana or, wherever in the world, right? I mean, obviously, because on the one hand, it's making huge amounts of money. As you said, in certain areas, it's making lots of money for people. What can we as consumers do to try to advocate for the folks that are living this poverty-stricken life in places like Ghana?
Yeah, and it's a fantastic question because, when I said before about change on a global scale seems not in the immediate future as far as I can tell. And part of that intractability, of the exploitation and the poverty, I think it's really due to the fact that the multinational chocolate companies have profit as their goal, right? Like, these are not charities. They are not philanthropic organizations. They are businesses. And, in the form that capitalism is taken today, profit and shareholder value are really the only goals. And so, I think that consumers have really played a role in putting pressure on these companies, and they've done that in a number of ways. Some by simply buying other types of chocolate, right? Like the small batch craft chocolate makers, the medium-sized companies who might be a little bit more focused on the producers that are selling to them. Sometimes it's by signing a petition. There was just a Lindt chocolate company really just had to bow to some pressure recently from consumers who, I can't remember the number, but some very large number of people signed a petition to Lindt chocolate company, with a demand for certain better practices in their sourcing. So I think but really what it comes down to for me always is educating ourselves. I don't think that I have the luxury of doing this as a career, right? I spend all my time thinking about this and learning about what the different companies are doing, and that is not what I think everyone should spend their time doing. But I think that we can all make a choice to learn something more, right? And to pick a company, pick a project, pick a country, right? And just do that little bit of learning and inquiry, and that is where ideas come from. That is where consumer pressure comes from, and that is where creative responses to this industry come from, is when we learn.
Yeah, I always emphasize the power of boycotting. Place your pocketbook where your values are. That without question, that's always a way that that consumers can let their voices be heard. But I appreciate your call to be mindful, as you say, mindful in our purchasing, and maybe just go out and do the research, right? So her book, it's called Cocoa, and the author's name is Kristy Leissle. And we need to take a break, so we'll be back after these short messages. You are listening to Dialogue, and joining us today is author Kristy Leissle. Her book is Cocoa, where she highlights the dramatic inequity between the chocolate manufacturers and the cocoa producers. Welcome back again.
Yeah.
Why do you think there is such a huge disconnect between the comforts of the privileged world and the discomforts in the not-so-privileged world, where the privileged world gets much of its resources from, or its root resources from? Why is there such a disparity there, almost an amnesia-like treatment of product, whatever product we're buying? I was just talking to someone about immigration, and I said, isn't it true that in some ways every time we indulge in illicit drug use, there is blood on our hands? And she said, absolutely. Sure. And it's the same kind of thing when we eat our chocolate that we love so much. Part of us is signing off on these people living on $200 a day. How do we get ourselves to more connected to that concept?
It's an absolutely fantastic question. And, how did we get here? How do we have this kind of veil over our eyes where we're just not seeing the origins? And there's, again, it's historically very complex. I think colonialism had a lot to do with it, because the colonial system really in many ways is what set up production here certainly in West Africa in the form that it is today. I mean, this goes back to French and British colonization of nearly the whole African continent, and that was a system that was set up to take resources out of one place very cheaply and create something more valuable out of them someplace far away. And so that legacy has endured, right? And so we are dealing with a historical legacy that I think most of us spend like zero time thinking about. We are not students of colonialism, and why would we be, right? This is like a century ago. So I think part of it is just the historical piece that we don't keep before us, that we don't have as part of our everyday conversation and discourse, because there's like very little motivation or incentive to do that, but it's really present. And I really think that one of the major factors here is like sheer distance, right? Because most of us do not live anywhere near a cocoa farm. And so things change the closer you get to cocoa origin, right? And I think that it is such a vast distance to travel. And we are busy people, and we have so much going on in our lives, and it is not realistic for everyone to just say, okay, now I'm going to go to the tropics and investigate this so I can have that firsthand experience. We've got a lot to do for ourselves to keep our own lives, in order.
But that's what you're for. That's what you're for. You're helping us do the research. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. I mean, and I feel really fortunate to be in that role, because that's if I'm making any contribution, I believe that's it. It's trying to bring people closer when they can't do it themselves.
It brings to mind the importance of international journalism. How important that is. The voices from outside coming to bring us. You bring us the voices from the outside and the realities from the outside and help connect us. And also the impact. What do you think how the social media, internet, technology, that world is contributing to our ability to get more information? Do you think that's actually making an impact as well?
Yes and no. I mean, I think that, most of my Twitter and Instagram accounts, I mean, the ones I follow are chocolate and cocoa related. And so I have a kind of, that's the view I get when I'm engaging with social media. And, this isn't a novel thought, but most people are sharing, the beautiful side of things. And so I think, I see a lot of images of like ripe cocoa pods and chocolate bars that are like swirled in a beautiful way and like with different ingredients laid on. And so I think that in some ways it's really powerful that, I can stay connected, at a glance with what, my colleagues are doing all around the world, and I can easily track what's happening in like Vietnam or Belize or, even right here in Ghana. And so in that way, it's a powerful tool. On the other hand, there's really not that many people who are showing you like the pit toilet in the village, right? It's just like not what we do on social media. And so I do think we get a bit of an exoticized view if we're engaging with this kind of information sharing.
Yeah, the imagery, the selling of the chocolate is not exactly an honest picture.
No, because chocolate is very sexy. And what's happened increasingly is that cocoa has become sexy too, right? And so
isn't that funny that we turn chocolate into sexy? I mean, on some level, it's just like, folks, it's food. But we make it becomes this, we attribute, the marketing, the advertising attributes sexy to chocolate and, Valentine's Day and all those things. And as you said, let's not forget the pit that people are, on the cocoa farm. I mean, that's not exactly a sexy moment, I would imagine, when you're using that whole, No. It's like the farthest thing from it, right?
It is. I mean, when we're in the really, not every cocoa farming area is like this, but many are, and when you're there, for me, it's like, to be honest, I don't really like it. Like I physically, and like mentally, psychologically, it's a very challenging thing to do. Of course, when I'm there, I'm learning and I'm so grateful and I feel filled with gratitude, to be able to be in that space. But it's not nice, and I just feel like that's a reality that is not brought to the forefront, very often. I think that the image of cocoa is really moving closer to the image of chocolate in certain circles, anyway, and becoming an exoticized thing.
Yeah. So learning the difference between cocoa, as you said in the beginning, and chocolate. Very different worlds, very different realities. What I can absolutely appreciate about your mission, in a sense, to write this book is to bring voice to this inequity that happens in capitalism, global capitalism. And I just wonder if we're entering a new era where we're going to start having more of these kinds of conversations. What are the things that could help contribute to bringing forth more of these kind of conversations?
Yeah, that is a great question. I think that we do need to continue having these conversations and at a maybe a larger scale than we have been. And so I think that's a really important element of this. What I've noticed is that there's a lot of dynamism in the chocolate industry nowadays. We have conferences, we have gatherings, and where people working in cocoa, people working in chocolate, small companies, big companies, are there together. And what I really feel is that we're all kind of talking to each other. Someone made this point to me the other day, and it really opened my eyes. And I thought, yeah, you know what? That's right. We're all just sitting in the same room, and the conversation needs to become wider than that. And so I think part of it is definitely an industry responsibility to share information, but not just any information and not just in any old way. I was part of a conference a few weeks back. Well, one of the panelists that was on the same panel as me was talking about writing transparency reports and finding out that nobody read them. and so part of the responsibility, I think, within the industry is to generate ways to actually make people engage, right? Make people want to engage, because I mean, this individual was talking about a transparency report that I read from start to finish every year when it comes out, and I don't know how many people do that. And so, what responsibility do we have, as people working in this industry, to share things in a way that actually makes people want to engage with them? And I think there's consumer responsibility too, right? Like but again, I really believe that we all have to make choices. Like we are all busy, and it takes a lot to keep a household going, right? It takes a lot to pay the bills. Like it takes a lot to raise a family, right? Like we all have these priorities. And what I genuinely believe is that if every person just picked one thing, right, to learn more about, to educate themselves about, then collectively we would suddenly have so much more power. Like it could be cocoa, it could be chocolate, it could be anything, right? It could be sugar, it could be petroleum, it could be, homelessness in one's neighborhood. I mean, but if we each just picked our one thing and learned, then I think we'd start to see some scale of change, right? And so I definitely am not advocating that every single person now, read my book cover to cover and learn everything there is to know about chocolate, because I don't think it's realistic for everyone. But if that's motivating for you, if you have a passion for that, then definitely do it, right? We will all be better off.
Yeah, it brings to mind, there was a campaign a few years ago, the red tag label or something. Do you remember that? I can't remember the name of it actually, but it was something about where does this product come from? And they would give you kind of a background on where the product came from. And if it had a red label, it was safe to buy. If it didn't, it wasn't. Sure. So, I mean, these kinds of campaigns seem to be moving us in the right direction. And lately, I've been thinking so much. I myself struggle with these kinds of questions, and I've been thinking, and it's easy to get hopeless in today's world, right? When you see these huge multi-billion-dollar national companies going multinational companies, and the top CEOs are making tons and tons of money, and the inequity just seems so unjust. And in fact, people are saying we're in a gilded age we've never known before. Not even the robber barons, at the turn of the Industrial Revolution, were close to where we are now. And so there's this human disconnect that seems to be going on even more than it ever has. But I'm finding my hope in the notion that I think at root people, including CEOs who make tons and tons of money, want to be good people. That our general nature as human beings is to want to connect, to want to learn, to not be enemies. Who likes conflict? Nobody likes conflict. I mean, maybe your politicians engage in conflict to get elected, but people as human beings, we don't really like conflict. And so it makes me wonder if we as human beings, the consumers, if we can do more things like this to say, as you say, be mindful in our practices of eating chocolate, where we're buying our chocolate. Take a little time, get on Google, look it up. Maybe not even Google, go on to Bing or any other place you want to go to the library, talk to a friend, just try to find out more about where the chocolate is coming from, and just try to connect the product we're buying with where it's born from, and be more mindful consumers. I mean, maybe as we then are able to educate ourselves, we can hold those multinational companies accountable and ask them to engage with us in practices like Starbucks with the fair trade. When they first came out, right, there was that whole fair trade. We engage in fair trade practices.
Yeah.
Do you see things do you think Hershey or Nestle could you see them ever getting on board something like that if consumers pushed hard enough for something like that?
Oh, totally. And I think that's been a consumer achievement, is that they really already have. I mean, there was a few years back when most of the big five chocolate companies, which is Mondelez, which is Cadbury brands, Hershey, Mars, Nestle, and Ferrero, really pretty much all took some kind of label. Mainly it was fair trade, but others, other labels also to certify that they were moving towards sustainable practices and trade justice. And now most of them have moved away from fair trade or to their own kind of internally generated certification systems. And so, but they're definitely talking about it. I mean, impact is very challenging to know. I mean, I don't think we could ever at this stage understand what the impact of some of these initiatives have been. The numbers just aren't, the information's just not there for me to make an assessment on that. But the great thing is that at least the dialogue has changed, or the discourse has changed, right? And the companies are at least now talking about sustainability and not so much trade justice. It's really much more about sustainability, but thinking about their sourcing in a way that they hadn't previously demonstrated, and that, I think that's in large part due to consumer advocacy. But I would also say that I say this in the book, but I'll say it more strongly here, is that I think the more power you have in this industry, the greater your responsibility is to kind of put yourself in someone else's position. I mean, I would love it if the CEO of every one of those big companies had to spend 2 weeks a year living on a poor cocoa farm, experiencing the material deprivations. I mean, for me, that would be a great thing in this industry. And the more you benefit from this, the more you should put yourself in the conditions of the most vulnerable, people and the most exploited people in this industry. I doubt that anyone would take me up on that. But
I had a similar thought. I was like, wait, you could do eco cocoa tours, go to the cocoa farm. If you want to see what life is really like,
there,
right? Really live there.
And not dip a toe in, because that's pretty much what I see people do, and they dip a toe in. They get in a comfortable air-conditioned car and drive out to a farm and look around for an hour or so, and then come back to the capital where everything is calm and easy and air-conditioned and lovely.
Yeah, you never know. I mean, you never know.
You never know.
People
right?
might jump on stuff like that in the future. Socially responsible business, right? As it becomes perhaps more hip, maybe they'll be like, well, can I go in my, high-end Land Rover? And, they have these things like glamping tours now. And they do have eco tours that raise our consciousness. And perhaps this is another means of educating. And wouldn't it be wonderful if we could do it with the folks who are as you said, the higher, the more power you have, or influence, then you have the more responsibility. So maybe we consumers could actually ask our CEOs to engage in things like that, or we could create it and they could, jump on board. And who knows? I know that's being idealistic, right? But wouldn't it be great?
I do want to say that there's people, not in the big multinationals that I know of anyway, but in the smaller companies, in what we call the craft chocolate companies in the U.S. I mean, there's a few, of my friends and colleagues out there who are really doing that, and the Dandelion chocolate comes to mind. The cocoa sourcer there, his name is Greg D'Alessandra. Of everybody I know who's sourcing, Greg probably spends the most time on farms and in those truly uncomfortable situations where I think we learn empathy. Where you're really kind of doing the things that other people do in their everyday lives. That's where how we learn how to empathize, I think. There's an importer, Meridian Cacao. The founder of that is Gino Dalla Gasparina. He also does a great deal of this work where really just spending time on the farms. Another organization that works importing specialty cocoa is Uncommon Cacao. That was founded by a woman named Emily Stone. Emily also is out there spending time, right, in these places, living in the everyday circumstances, that the producer organizations, that is the Cocoa Farmer Associations, are also living in. And I really admire these folks. I think that they are just doing that thing I'm talking about and getting to know the origin of the products that we ultimately really love. And so, again, these are people working at a much smaller scale, but they're setting a great example, I think, for others in the industry.
Yeah, in fact, it makes me think maybe we could have a TV show called "Where Did This Come From?" that literally tracks, right? That goes to the original source material and highlights that, as opposed to just on. I mean, they have the whole how stuff is made or how stuff works, and sometimes they'll do that.
Yeah.
But they don't stay long. They might not stay very long on the source origin, the location of the original product. But it would be interesting to actually really spend time there. And I have to thank you for your work in doing so. I also I worked on a farm here in New Mexico, and believe me, there were people out there working with the mosquitoes, working the farm, and I was inside the bakery, so I wasn't on the farm. But boy, I'll tell you, it wasn't a place I wanted to be, and that's in the United States. But I didn't want to be out there with the mosquitoes, and
Sure.
Farm life is not easy, and I can't imagine how much more challenging it is in places like Africa.
It's very challenging, and I would make no claim whatsoever to have anything even approximating, the real material deprivation, that I have witnessed in the bush. I mean, I live a very materially comfortable life in the capital. It's like, I cannot emphasize that enough. I mean, we have everything here, right? Like everything you could imagine as far as infrastructure and comforts. So my daily life is extremely comfortable. I'm living in Ghana, but it's like, it doesn't feel very different from living in London or Seattle, as far as my everyday surroundings. And then it is, I'm moving back into a research period now where I will be in the bush, and I will be really honest. Like, I will make provision for myself to be more comfortable than I maybe deserve, right? Because it's just not easy, right? And so I will look for guest houses, and I will look for guest houses that have plumbing and electricity, and it's just that hard, right? It's just that hard to be in the rural environments here that I think it is just a tricky just scenario to want to do this research and to be living here and being really, really aware that I am in no way experiencing the kind of material challenges that the farmers are experiencing.
Yeah, I'm just curious, why did you decide to research this kind of a topic?
Oh boy! I mean, I started with my PhD, right? So I did my PhD by studying this industry, and specifically here in Ghana and in the UK, and I've just never stopped. I think you do a PhD and you need the thing that's going to sustain you, right? It took me 8 years to do my doctoral degree, and chocolate was the thing I had loved better than anything else my whole life, and so. When the opportunity came to study it for my PhD, I really, grabbed it. And I've just I never get tired of it. I never get bored. The challenges are there, but they are, they would never stop me, because it's a real privilege to do this. And for me, the kind of lifelong learning that I feel like I'm in is way more important to me than any material discomfort that I might be in, and the kind of psychological, like, it can be very challenging to recognize my own privilege and know that I'm writing about people who are not going to benefit from my work really at all, in a kind of material way, and just trying to keep that present in my mind all the time, about my own power, relative to the people that I'm researching with and interviewing. And for me, why do I do all of this? Is because I love it, because really fulfilling for me, and it keeps me active, it keeps me thinking, it keeps me aware of my own privilege, it keeps me aware of power and how power works in this world, and it's incredibly humbling in many, many ways.
Yeah, and it keeps us educated as well, and on all the important ways. So I want to. You're somebody who got her PhD and actually learned something. That's what I would say. Sometimes I say people get their PhDs, and if you haven't gotten the inequity question, like if that hasn't occurred to you that you're now not better than everyone else just because you think you've got a PhD, if you miss that, somehow you didn't learn anything. But clearly you've devoted your life, after getting your PhD, to the questions of inequity and what better way and what greater contribution. So I want to thank you so much for joining us today, Kristy. And if you're interested in her book, it's called Cocoa, and the author's name is Kristy Leissle. And I want to thank you again so much for taking the time out of your busy world to join us here.
It's been fantastic to talk with you. I've really appreciated it and just had a really great conversation with you. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you, listeners, for joining us right here on Dialogue, where the conversation starts with you. We'll see you next week right here on KSFR 101.1 FM.
Talk to me. Talk to